Good morning. My name is Gregory. I was born in Lindsay in 1926. The reason I was born in Lindsay is because my grandfather came to Lindsay from England and started building a drugstore. He was with a partner who was a druggist, who at that time were tradesmen. They were practical people learning by experience, and he learned to be a druggist through them. He was first of all in Cavanville and built a drugstore with the help of a wealthy friend in Lindsay in 1860. He eventually met a girl called Mary Wright in the Wesleyan Church by the river in Lindsay, and he married Mary, who was 18 years younger than him, in June 1867. He had become a druggist through experience with other people called druggists who had learned also by practical experience, because there was no school of pharmacy in Canada nor in England in which he came from. With Mary, Edmund had 6 children. 4 of them became druggists. 1 of them became an engineer. The youngest, my father, who was born in 1883, was left behind when his father died. Without his fatherly advice, the advice of his father, my father, son going on to further education, and quit high school and became an apprentice to a hardware store, J.G. Edwards on Kent Street. He later on moved out west to Winnipeg, Kenora, and several western places like that. His experience was increased. In 1919, he came back to Lindsay, and with the help of his brothers, who were wealthier than he was, my father started a hardware store, and he took over McLeod's Limited on Kent Street, and in 19 he was president of that store, which they had bought as a family store. Also in 1919 he married my mother, Marie Gillette, whom he had met in Windsor, Ontario, when he was working in a hardware store there, and she was working in a bank next door. They were married in Coburg, and they came to Lindsay and lived in a lovely red brick house on Upper Cambridge Street. They, of course, had children, and there were 2 sons born to them. My brother, oldest brother, was born in 1922. I was born in 1926. When I was due, my father was already in hospital. He had septicemia, was near death. I arrived, and I was born while he was on the fringe of death. He ultimately recovered from septicemia, which is a sort of a blood poisoning, but very dangerous. And in those days, there was no cure. He was saved from death after I was born by a transfusion like that with his 17-year-old nephew, Bill Gregory. Actually, Charles Arthur Gregory, his name, but everybody called him Bill. He was in hospital for a long time after my birth, and I know he was released in September 1926 because the Lindsay Daily Post had 2 greetings on the 9th and 10th of September. We grew up in Lindsay, went to Alexandra School in North Ward, and we're quite happily located. My mother was very popular. She was artistic and she sang well, was frequently a soloist with Cambridge Street United Church, and she took part in plays and things like that of artistic nature. My father was retired. He did not go for that himself, and he was sometimes a little jealous of the male attention my mother got. We came along. Dad was the president of McLeod's on Kent Street, and we were doing pretty well before he was sick. And after he was sick, his brother Keel, who was one of the druggists, came down from his drugstore in Toronto to help Dad, who was still sick until September, run the store in Lindsay. It was a family store. It went pretty well. Dad was back in the store with us in September, and Keel was so fond of the experience he had there that he decided to sell his store in 1927 and stay with Dad in the McLeod's. They did until the end of the 30s, when the Depression was really starting to hit. McLeod did pretty well under the two of them until 1934. And 1934, McLeod went bankrupt, along with a lot of other stores, my grandfather's store in Coburg, and plenty of other stores in Lindsay and around the country. We lost everything. Our brothers or Dad's brothers who had invested in the store lost all the money they had invested, but they had their own businesses and were better satisfied and did not really suffer except the loss of money. We lost everything: our house, my mother's cherished piano, most of our furniture. We had lost our house, of course, and that was upsetting enough to Mother and I. My brother Donald, who was older, reacted strongly to the fact that he lost all his possessions, essentially, and he started petty thefts, for which he was caught and tried in court and sentenced to boys' school in Bowmanville. It was a training school for boys set up by service clubs. It eventually became a penitentiary, but he was sent there when it was a boys' school. My father was sent, along with about several hundred other Lindsay men, to work on roads in North Victoria County in a Ontario government program of road construction. My father was 52 at the time, and the road construction was too much for his body. He had never trained in that area. So they moved him into records up there in their office. And he had a telephone, I guess. I don't know for sure. I never asked him. And he somehow found a job in Belleville, Ontario. And he had found a job in Belleville, which was as manager of the hardware department in Canadian department stores. He had asked to stay away for the summer because he had not found a place for me to go to school or a place for her to live. So he visited our Uncle Clarence, my mother's brother, at Stony Lake. While we were there, my brother came from on holidays from a Belleville school because he had had an operation on his ears and he needed a holiday in non-hospital, non-Bowmanville environment. So we had him for a week or two, and then we joined. Mother went down to Belleville with my father, and they found a house, and they found a school for me to go to near there. Don went back to Bowmanville. Mother and I went to Belleville in August and moved into this lovely house, another brick house on the east side of the city. Dad worked downtown with CDS, and we had a lovely time in Belleville until March the 12th, 1936, when the Moira River flooded and was the largest flood in the history of that time, wiped out the hardware department in the hardware store. My father helped it cleaned up and found out that there was no job. They were not redoing the hardware department at the present time. So we had a house that we couldn't keep. My mother found an apartment. My brother had gone back. My father was out looking for a job at the time in Kingston, selling vacuum cleaners. He had a job, which wasn't very a prosperous thing to do at that time. My mother and I moved into the apartment. I went to the school that I had gone to by bus across the river. I did well in that school, and then my father could not tolerate any more jobs. He had jobs of building the bridge across the St. Lawrence River, and he just could not do it. It was just too much for him. He was much older then. He came back, and we found that he could not get a job in Belleville because he was not a local boy.
Hey, how are you?
The people in the various offices did not know him. In the labor department, they did not know him. In the welfare department, and the business people did not know him because he had not been in town very long. Fortunately, after 3 years of living like this, they were wretched years, bounced back in and out. My brother still wreaking damage because he didn't think society had treated his family very well, and he was back in prison several times. My father finally got a job in Lindsay in 1939 in the Liquor Control Board store on Kent Street South side. And that was through Les Frost, with whom father had worked with in the early days in Lindsay when he was with the liberal conservatives, not quite the conservatives that Les Frost was with, but Les knew him through that connection. We were in Lindsay in 1939, and I started out in LCI, grade 9, took part in the field days ever after, and have various ribbons and things to show that I did pretty well. And of course, 1939 was the start of World War II. My brother enlisted, went overseas with the Army in the Signal Corps in Belgium. I went to school and played rugby, and other athletics, as I said, ran against Jim Mackey and other people. In the school was wartime, of course, and we took all sorts of precautions. We had to be careful on what we did because the arsenal is expected to be a target, and so we knew all about taking shelter if it was attacked. And our parents were wardens for blackouts and things like that. School was held up. We couldn't work in places downtown during the blackouts because shelter was not as easily available for us as kids. I managed to get through LCI with credits and ended up going to the University of Toronto, and from then on was my profession, which was geology. And that's about all I can say at this time.